remember Dan Farr's talk? It wasn't that long ago. Where he was trying to put an economic value, or at least seeking to see ways of putting economic value on ecosystem services. And we'd all agree when it comes to forestry, forests are wonderful places to explore, but of course they also have an obvious economic benefit. Jack Sadler was formerly on the board of AI Bio. He's at the University of British Columbia in the forest products, biotechnology, bioenergy field, and he is going to talk to us about thinking about forests in a completely, or almost completely different way from the way they've been traditionally regarded. Jack.
So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's been a great honor to be associated with the AI Bio board. So I apologize, I'm going to use a few British Columbia examples here in my presentation, but we're all part of the best side of the country.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on the election?
I don't want to comment on the election. So this is an area I've been working on for quite some time. So the logo that's not quite showing up here should have the IA Bioenergies, the International Energy Agency. So the IA was actually created back in the late 70s because of the OPEC oil crisis. So I think I can see some people in the audience have got the same hairstyle as me. So you will remember, the OPEC oil crisis in terms of with oil and basically suddenly realizing that this was controlled by certain people. So in the 10 minutes, what I hope to get over is to think of one of the resources we have, which is our forests, which I think are incredibly valuable, as Dan showed, in terms of how we use it for recreation. But we also value it for its structural material. So we use it for making pulp and paper, for furniture, for housing. But my main theme here is to think in terms of how long it takes for us to grow a tree in Canada. So this is a picture of our building at UBC. You can see very high value use for wood. Again, it's both structurally and it looks good. This is the podium. Our graduate students actually made the podiums for the Winter Olympics in Vancouver. So this is a very high value use for wood when you think of it. So really we tend to think of forests or trees for its structural value. This is a picture of me actually while I was dean trying to allocate teaching at UBC, trying to convince some of my colleagues. But again, the main application here is a structural application. So my point is that we're not going to take a really good tree and make it into energy. We're going to use all the material that we currently don't use. There's a large amount of forest that we don't use. And I guess my point is to think of this in terms of generations. So if you look at where we are just now, is it wasn't that long ago. So you go back to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was driven by coal. And really, oil started to make an appearance at the start of the 19th century. And if any of you are, again, as old as me to remember Dustin Hoffman in The Graduate, he was told to think of plastics. So really, plastics really just started in about the 50s or so. And really, as we move into really, again, we move from oil more into natural gas. I guess my premise, though, is we're eventually, I'll get this right eventually, is we're going to start moving into more and more renewables. So if you look at globally, renewables are increasing, and particularly in places like Denmark, where the national flower is the windmill. You can start seeing more and more use and move towards renewables. This is Hilbert's Curve, you may have heard of. This is all the predictions about when the oil is going to run out. Of course, the oil will never run out. It'll always be there. It's just going to get very expensive to get. It's also going to cause us environmental problems. So essentially, this is a finite resource. So it will eventually, even in Alberta, is eventually going to run out. So one of the things I learned with being the Dean of Forestry at UBC was working with our First Nations Aboriginal groups, and I didn't realize that all of the history was oral. So this is an oral history, nothing is written down. And really our First Nations tend to think of terms in generations. So if you look at yourself, you might know your great-grandparents and you might know your great-grandchildren, but that's about it. So you're really looking at a space of 100 years. And really what they pointed out to me is if you look at my great-grandparents, well, they didn't have a car, a TV, a fridge, a washing machine. Effectively, they had none of those products. I look, when I was growing up, and we tended to have our weekday clothes and our Sunday clothes. Effectively, now we get rid of clothes because they're not fashionable, not because we've worn them out. So really what's happening is things are changing. For example, unfortunately for the forest products sector is my great-grandchildren won't be reading newspapers because they'll be reading it off the tablet. But one thing is happening is energy and chemical use are going up. So if you look at luxuries, meat is no longer considered a luxury in many parts of the world. So again, a vast amount of fertilizer. So the bottom line is that energy use is going to go up. If I look at this generationally, so this is data that we've taken from the International Energy Agency. I'm a proud baby boomer right here. The only reasons why my kids aren't up here is they've not lived as long as I have. But basically, if you start looking at energy use, I mean, how many of you got your beer fridge in the basement? You've got your TV in the spare room. You look at how much energy we use now compared to when we were the age of our children. The other thing that's happening is India and China. With having several Chinese students, what they explained to me is I looked at a generation in terms of my generation. They were pointing out that their parents, this was the big four they wanted. They wanted to have a watch, a manual sewing machine, a radio, and a bike. If you look at very quickly, they then wanted the fridge, the air conditioner, the sewing machine, and now they want a car. So effectively, energy use is compressed. Instead of what took us 3 generations, it's actually taken them a couple of decades. So again, this is making the point that energy consumption is going to go up. So what has happened relatively recently is this is taken from the Vancouver Sun. So the first time, this is from June 2007. So the first time the mountain pipe beetle became more publicly aware. And again, when I show this to a European audience, it puts things in perspective how things have changed. This is BC in about 13, 14 years ago, and this is where the outbreak started in Tweedsmuir Park. And again, as you normally know, the beetle is actually the Ophiostoma fungus in the saliva of the beetle that rings the tree, and it's the fungus cutting off the nutrients to the tree that kills the tree. But usually, about here, we'd get minus 30 for 3 weeks, and so that would make the beetle feel very uncomfortable. And effectively, it would knock things back. But our winters have been getting steadily warmer to the extent that when you look at next year, this is the area in BC. It's slowing down a bit in Alberta, but I think, as you know, the transfer to Alberta went a lot quicker than anybody predicted. But the area of dead and dying lodgepole pine is about 17 million hectares. So to put that in perspective, it's about half the size of Japan. And to show you how things changed, again, 15 million hectares is the equivalent to Denmark and Portugal added together. And you can see how not much change and then how dramatic the death of the trees are. So big change. And so unfortunately for most of Canada, a lot of these dead and dying trees were available at the same time as the US housing market nosedived. So if you look at where we actually took these trees and we were going to actually sell it to the market that we would traditionally sell it to, disappeared. So what happened really since 2000 to about now is the silver lining in this problem has been the growth of the wood pellet market. So how this originated is as we would cut up lumber, there would be the sawdust left over, which about 10, 15 years ago we would have as a problem. We'd have to landfill it, or we'd burn it in TP burners or beehive burners. And then there was a recognition that this could actually be a good energy source. And also it was relatively carbon neutral. So effectively this carbon had been sequestered by photosynthesis, so effectively we were recycling the carbon. So what has happened is that now, just this year actually, the US has superseded Canada or British Columbia in terms of the amount of pellets exported. But most of this material goes into combustion. So it's burned, instead of using coal, we'll put in the pellets into a coal power station and burn it there as a way of reducing carbon emissions. However, the work we've been looking at now is what we call the biorefinery. So the same way as if you look at oil, what has happened with oil is oil was originally used as an energy source. But again, if I go back to Dustin Hoffman and the Graduates, it was about 60, 70 years ago, we realized oil was far more valuable as a source for plastics, for dyes, for all the polymers. I mean, if you look at Lululemon would not survive without oil. So effectively, you need that chemical feedstock. So what we've been looking at is, if you start looking at where most of oil goes, the vast majority goes into gasoline and diesel. And it's this 4 or 5% that actually gives you the vast majority of what we get from oil, the plastics, the chemicals, and the rubber. And so the analogy here with an oil refinery, you look at an oil refinery here, and this gives the multiple products, which I know you can't read, but this basically says the gasolines, the kerosenes, the plastics. What we're looking at here then is the residue, both agricultural residue. I'm using forestry as an example here, but the wheat straw and a lot of the material that we don't currently use, both for some of the heat and power that we use for fuels and chemicals, but also what we call the sugar platform, taking the sugars that are in wood and trying to make the various chemicals out there. And a good example just now is Brazil, starting off with sugarcane. And Brazil now has probably 2/3 of its transportation fuel now coming from sugar. And many of the companies now, like the Dows and the DuPonts and the Shells, have started to put facilities into Brazil to basically use the cheap sugars there as a feedstock for these various products. So where's the opportunity for the forest sector is if we, again, do analogies between the oil sector. Again, if you look at transportation fuel, so transportation fuel is, again, about 2/3 of what we use oil for. And that gives us about 43% of the value. This 4%, which is really the feedstock for the plastics, gives you the 42% of value. So effectively, you can see that the value proposition from oil goes from this very small amount into this big bit. When we start looking at the forest sector, similarly, we're looking at structural applications. 45% here is the solid wood, so this goes into your furniture in your houses, gives a fair amount of the value. This is pulp and paper, but the huge opportunity for the forest sector is this 1/3 that currently only gives us 6% of the value. So that material gives us some of the pellets that we currently use, but this is, again, has the potential for giving us the various chemicals and products that can be made from oil. So the goal is really to try and make better use, derive higher value of this 1/3 and use it as a feedstock for chemicals, fuels, nutraceuticals. So everything from Taxol with biomedical all the way through to some of the biodegradable chemicals that people like Coca-Cola are putting into their bottles. So currently the research underway has three main themes. There's the power that goes into electricity. There's the traditional products that Canada, I think, is still a leader in, making products such as nanocrystalline cellulose that will go into computer screens. But the work that many people in Canada have been looking at is to take these sugars, start making both the ethanol, the butanediol, some of these different chemicals that we currently get from oil. So I just want to touch on some of the research that we've been doing. Nature designed wood not to be broken down. So if you look at, again, one of the questions I usually will ask my graduate student is, what's a potato made out of? And they'll say starch, and I'll say, well, what is wood mostly made out of? And it's cellulose. So basically you'll say, well, what's the fundamental building block of cellulose and the fundamental building block of starch? Well, they're both made of glucose. So if you realize that glucose is that simple product, but nature, just because of the way it rearranged the sugar, one is a very good structural material and one's very good to make French fries out of. So really what we have to do is use some form of mechanical means to open it up. And the work that our research has been looking at is that using molecular biology and different enzymology, we have a good idea of when we go from this material here down to these sugars. But the step we've been looking at is how do we actually open up this material here? So in this video I'm going to show you, so this video, which is about a minute, is actually about $4.5 million worth of research. So this is work that we did jointly with the National Renewable Energy Lab. So really what I was going to show pictorially here towards the end, if you can get that second last slide, is some of the work that we have been doing, and I know my colleague David Bressler at the University of Alberta is doing similar work. So again, we look here at the cellulose, and as I said, we have a pretty good idea how it works on the outside. But the problem is the enzymes can't get in there. So how the heck do the enzymes actually get in to break it down? And what we really want to try and do is to find some way of what we call this a morphogenesis step, so that the enzymes get a lot happier. And we do this with using steam pretreatment and also by getting the combination of the enzymes right. And this is effectively coming to make what we call a sugar platform. Can we make cheap sugars from straw, from wood residues? So in conclusion, I think the potential to move from a hydrocarbon, oil and gas, to a carbohydrate, meaning agriculture and forest, I think is inevitable because oil and gas is finite, and if we manage our forests and farms properly, there should be infinite. And we should all think in terms of generations, not the next quarter. Thanks.
So Jack, you mentioned that critical issue of trying to get access to the cellulose, which is within. Is that the most, I mean, is that the challenge right now? Because I sort of imagine there might be several others.
No, there's one of the logical ones is how much are you going to pay for the feedstock? So how things quickly change is it becomes a residue, but as soon as someone seems to be making money from your residue, they want some money for something that you used to give them for free. So there's some hard economics about making it work. But from a research point of view, I mean, fundamentally, understanding, I mean, nature's done a great job of making biomass last for a long time. So I think there's a lot that we still have to figure out how to deconstruct things quicker.